I'm Miwa Messer. I'm the producer and host of Poured Over, and Sarah Chihaya has written a book that, if you're a book lover, will surprise you in some ways and will absolutely not surprise you in other ways. It's called Bibliophobia, and it's her first memoir. You also know as a critic, her work has appeared in the New York Review of Books and The Nation and all sorts of other places, The New Yorker, too. And she's also the co-author of a book from Columbia University Press that I'm going to hold for a minute and come back to, because she has significantly changed my mind on something that I thought my mind could not be changed on. But Sarah, I'm really happy we get to hang out and do this, but Life Ruiner. We have to start with Life Ruiner. This is sort of the whole soul of your book, is there are books that are in fact life ruiners in a good way for readers. And yours is one that I adore, but I will say was not my life ruiner. But can we start there?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me, Miwa. I'm really excited to talk to you. I can't wait to find out what your life ruiner is. I really, part of me is like, I only wrote this book because I'm very nosy and I really want to know what everyone's reading, like what changed their lives. Like I'm I'd be very happy if all of my book events were just me having people tell me what their life ruiners were. I'd in some ways prefer that. Yeah, this is very exciting. The life ruiner for me is, I know it sounds like a bad thing, and I not everyone always gets the meaning of the word ruin and how it can be both like a necessary thing and a bad thing and a good thing, a wonderful thing at the same time. It's like an experience that you have with a book from which you can never recover, which I think is a great thing. I think that's ideally, like, we're looking all the time for that experience with books. And partly the reason we're looking for them is because we have that experience with a life ruiner at some point in your life. And you're like, oh, books can do this to me. I want to keep reading to find the next one. So I have lots of life ruiners. Like I think anyone who loves books has lots of life ruiners. But the first one for me, and the one that I wrote about to talk about the concept in this book, is The Bluest by Toni Morrison, which is a book that changed me in many ways. Like it's a book that made me want to be a writer. It made me sort of jealous because it just did things with words that I didn't know were possible before. And I think that Morrison is just such a magician. Like it's so beautiful. It's so terrifying. It's so like it's just too much, like at once, and that's what's so spectacular about it. But it also sort of opened my eyes and made me look directly at things I didn't want to look directly at before in my life, specifically race and beauty, and how the mythologies around these two things are upheld by the world we live in. And I think that's really what The Life Ruiner does. Like, it's a book that not only makes you want to keep reading, but makes you read the world around you differently, and like makes you feel like you've seen something that you can't unsee. And I think, I read The List when I was 15 or 16, probably. I don't remember exactly when, but I have been trying very hard not to think of why I might feel uncomfortable, or like why I might not fit in, or why I felt like my family is weird. And through Morrison's novel, it made me look at some of the root causes, the historical and the social root causes that I didn't want to admit to or examine.
So I've read your book twice now, and the first time I whipped through it, I was like, what? I needed to know all of the books you were talking about. And then the second time I went back and I was reading more slowly, not just because of the books, but also you can read this book two different ways, right? Like, it is a book about books, obviously. It's also a book about Sarah. And I really like your criticism. I've been reading it, and you and I have kind of similar tastes. Like, you did Téa Obreht and The Morningside for the New Yorker.
I love that book. Yeah.
Right? It's great. That book is so good. I also love Inland, which is an earlier novel of hers, and they're all very Téa, and it's just. But you've also Elaine Hsieh Chou. You reviewed Dislocation, which I really liked as well.
Oh, I love the book. Yeah.
Right? She's really funny, and campus novels, right? Like campus. So, I mean, meeting you in this different way, right? When I've known your byline and I've known your criticism, and now it's like, oh, wow. I mean, I will say there's a lot. We're not going to go into deep detail here because I want readers to be able to experience the book the way I did, which is, I mean, the first time I had it, I had no flap copy. I literally had the book's title and your name. That's all I knew. And I think you had been given the Whiting Creative Nonfiction Grant at that point. You finished the book with the Whiting, right?
I did, yes.
Yeah, okay. So, like, I vaguely knew your name, and I knew I liked your taste. And this, now I feel like I really know you. Like, you and I need to start with Anne of Green Gables. Okay, Little House on the Prairie, Laura Ingalls Wilder, like, that is a touchstone for a lot of it. Like, Roxane Gay and I have had long conversations about that book. But Anne of Green Gables is kind of one that you don't hear. They're very old-fashioned novels, right? They're super old-fashioned.
Yeah, they really are.
And even like the Little Women contingent, right? Because I've read Little Women and I've read Little Men and whatever. I mean, I'm glad I read them. But there is a contingent that is like, you know. But Anne of Green Gables is like, I hadn't thought about those books until I saw you mention them. And I mean, you grew up Japanese American in Ohio. And there is like this Japanese cultural fascination with Anne of Green Gables.
There is, yeah.
Like, maybe we start there. I'm also Japanese American, so I'm just kind of like, I don't get it. I read the books when I was like 8. I mean, I liked the early ones, and then the marriage ones, I was like, why am I reading about marriage? This is not interesting.
It's kind of boring. Her kids are not as interesting as she is.
Yeah, right? I was like, wait.
Sadly, yes.
But how did you come to those books, and how did they sort of start the process of, I wouldn't say they were life ruiners for you, but they were eye-opening.
Yeah, they're sort of pre-life runners. They were the first books that became like more than anonymous to me. Like, I think I did a lot of reading of like chapter books and early reader books before Anne of Green Gables that, were like serial, like Babysitter's Club or Sweet Valley, that kind of book where you can just read like 50 of them and it's always kind of happening, but like it doesn't really matter, where you stop and where you start. I don't know. But the Anne books like gave me a sense that there's a person behind them. You see the character, these things happen to her, and you watch her progress and you watch the whole town change, and it was just really interesting to me to like live in that world, to have it be a whole world that was like all fleshed out. And that just really grabbed me and stuck with me for a long time. I mean, I've reread I can't say how many times I've reread most of those books because but you're right, they're very old-fashioned. Like, I just reread them for Bibliophobia and was really struck by how sort of nice they are. They're just like nice books from an earlier time of reading in which, and it's funny because, I think we really think of them as children's books, but Montgomery herself thought of herself as an adult writer. Like, she imagined that grown-ups would read these books as like great Canadian literature. So I think it's just interesting to think about like what we expect now from books and what she thought she was giving us. And maybe the disconnect between those things. But I started reading them. I remember my Canadian grandmother gave me the first book. My family sort of foisted these books upon me because, as you say, in Japan there is this tradition of like an obsession. And, I read in the book, in the end chapter in the book, about how there's actually an abandoned theme park in Hokkaido called Canadian World, which is hilarious. Like,
Sorry, I love this. It's like George Saunders, right? Bad decline in Civil War land, only this is real.
It doesn't seem like it can be real, but it's true. You can go there. I guess I've not been, but I really want to go. And it's since become, this is even weirder, it's like become a municipal park since it was built as an amusement park like in this time in the 90s when Japan was building like lots and lots of theme parks. But then it went out of business, and so the town nearest to it, this very small town, is like, well, I guess we'll buy it. Like, there's nothing else to do with it. It's this Victorian era Canadian village that's just in the middle of Hokkaido, like in the middle of nowhere. So they bought it and now it's a city park, which is hilarious. There's this long tradition of, Japan having their own version of Anne. And I learned when I was writing this book, I did some research into that history and learned that it actually dates back to the war and was a concerted effort on, as part of this effort to sort of re-educate the population, specifically the women, in the model of like liberal Western womanhood, like independent thinking, like young ladies. So it has this interesting pedagogical and political use in Japan that has since become, I think there was that, and then there was probably because people's children were encouraged to read it, there was this very successful anime series, and, out of that, it's just become this huge industry, and, in fact, like, many of the visitors to Prince Edward Island are Japanese. So I got a lot of stuff from I think my Japanese grandmother was just probably racking her brains and like, "What do children like? Like, what do Canadian children want?" And so she sent me this box. I'll never forget. She sent me this box full of like Anne stuff.
Mhm.
It was around the same time that I read the first book. And so it's like I had all this merch and I had this book and it's kind of like a in the 80s version of like being a book talker or something where I'd like been received all this stuff and I was like,
Right.
okay, this is my favorite book now. And I was like 7. I didn't know anything about books. It just there was this thing that had changed my life, and now I had all this stuff. There's like an Anne cookbook and like little like fridge magnets, like lots of little things that my grandmother in Japan sent me. So it was like it was coming at me from all sides.
Yeah, I mean, I was reading Paddington, Anne of Green Gables, Little House on the Prairie, and like Moomin books. All
Mhm,
because there's a whole Japanese thing about the Moomins too, which
mhm.
okay. But I was kind of reading them all in a like it never occurred to me that they weren't somehow related. But now I'm like, oh, that's basically the same book with different kind of thing happening.
It's true. It's
But
true.
I wouldn't necessarily call them life ruiners. It's like as a tiny person, like I always saw my parents reading. So my brother and I were readers and like we had the whole read at night before you went to bed thing. Dad did not do funny voices. My mother did funny voices. So like that's kind of how the story time breakdown happened. But later on though is when we get to sort of the obsessive bits, right? Like the oh wow, this is but Anne of Green I hadn't thought of those books in like 8 million years.
Yeah, they're deep inside somewhere. I think they're not life ruiners, but they were sort of like priming me for that kind of obsessive reading, like life-changing reading. They're like they're like gateway drugs, they're
Yeah.
books that make you feel like the world is bigger or like you can be in it in a different way than other books. And they're historical, so they were like I had no idea, like, when Queen Victoria was the queen. It was, like
Yeah.
it was very confusing to me at the time, but they just seemed so magical, and the island is so it seemed so far away. It seemed like this it's just I went from reading Anne to reading a lot of fantasy, and I think it
Yeah.
was, like, a kind of natural move. They're beautiful, and they're sort of nostalgic in this mysterious way and romantic. It makes sense that, I went from there to me, it makes sense, and I went from there to fantasy.
That I totally get. I'm not a big fantasy reader. I love that it's exciting for people and I love that it has brought I think a whole bunch of new readers,
Mm,
which I get very excited about because anyone who wants to hang out and read, I am so good with that. But I see lots of direct lines in ways like once you get to a book, right? And then it just becomes the sort of it's almost like a reflex for me, like walking or breathing or sleeping, like right? Like reading is just a thing that I do. And sometimes I want language, and sometimes I want character. And I want to go to something you say late in the book, which is you don't really identify with characters, which I find totally fascinating because a lot of the books you cite are very voicey, character driven kinds of books. And I like similar, I'm big on voicey. You and I don't have all of the, we have some overlap, but not all of the overlap. And I do like voicey books, but I want to talk to you about this not identifying with characters thing because I think it's a really fascinating statement to make.
It's something that I've thought about a lot, as a teacher, because students increasingly, like, more and more, they're interested in, like, relatable text or characters that they identify with, and if they don't like a character, they're like, "Well, I hate this book because I hated this character." And I'm like, "What's wrong with hating a character but loving the book?" And I think that, when I think of books, I think of the books of themselves as I think the way that other people think of characters, like, I think of the whole text as, like, the person that I'm interacting with, and that's not necessarily the author. The author, I actually very rarely think about the author, but I think of, texts as having their own personalities, and the characters are part of that. The characters contribute to that, but I tend not to get hung up on individual characters themselves rather than the feeling that the book as a whole gives me.
Yeah,
Mm.
I so get that. So you and I were talking about life ruiners beforehand, and I was telling you that I'd never really thought about the concept until I was prepping for this show. And so my life ruiner is very different from yours, but it's also not a novel. And I really had to think about this. And there's stuff that I have sort of now this list of sort of the books that built me.
Mm.
And ages ago, Ruth Ozeki and I had a conversation. She and I read a lot of Cheever and a lot of Updike when we were young, because she grew up in the suburbs of New Haven, and her dad was a professor, and I grew up in the suburbs of Boston. And, we read a lot of Cheever and a lot of Updike, and that always made me laugh. But Slouching Towards Bethlehem, the
Oh,
Didion
wow.
essay collection, I read it, I think I was maybe 14. And just the idea that, I mean, I didn't know anyone like Joan. You don't meet Joan Didions in the suburbs of Massachusetts, I promise you. And I was like, wait a minute, what is happening here? And then, there was a body of work, and then I went to the novels, and Play It As It Lays is still a book that I love and feels really timeless. But when I think about stuff as simple as like writing copy, I read a lot of copy. And I love writing book copy because it's fun, right? Like if you're going to talk about vibes, right? I'm like, oh yeah. And ages ago, I was working on a thing for the BNN Reads blog, and I'd left a bunch of Didion just around on the coffee table. And my dude he had never read Didion. And he starts reading it, and he just looks at me and he's like, "Am I meeting 14-year-old you?" It's like, well, actually.
It's so funny when people can see it in you.
And I honestly, I didn't really think about the life ruiner thing as hard as I was until obviously you and your book. But I love the idea that books become part of our DNA. That's something I've always felt very strongly. So I never called them life ruiners, but I used to say things like, it's a book that tattooed itself on my DNA.
Mm.
And
Yeah,
like,
right.
the list changes, right? So I was talking to colleagues, and I'm like, I'm afraid that Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas might be one of those books that, you read at a very young age and you're like, oh, this guy is what, or The Lover by Duras, which I have a very complicated relationship with.
Mhm.
And I mean, yeah, some of it is beautiful and some of it are like, right. And then she keeps rewriting that book, The North China
Mhm.
Lover. And I'm like, do you have to keep rewriting this book? Aren't we done? Like, can't you do screenplays and stuff? Because like, here's this one kind of almost perfect book, even though, it's showing its age. How about I say that? It's showing its age. And I have two different editions. One has an introduction by Maxine Hong Kingston, and the other is Viet Thanh Nguyen.
Oh, wow.
And which is the newest edition. And you like A Man of Two Faces the way I like
I
A Man
do.
of
Yeah.
That book is so good. And all respect to the novels, I prefer The Committed, but I just want to talk to you about that memoir because it feels like that memoir is so of a moment, but at the same time, I'm like, he could have written this in 1975 if he were around. Like, it feels like of that sort of moment where you're getting like the Frank Chins and like the Sean Wongs and all of these guys, right, are sort of coming out of you can see the line, right?
Mhm.
So when did you start reading Viet?
I started reading Viet as an academic, actually. I
Mm-hmm.
read his first book probably in grad school, I guess, and then, I got asked by PMLA to be part of, a roundtable on all of his work, so I read all of his books. like maybe 5 or 6 years ago. And I wrote this piece about how much I love them and how it was before he had written Man of Two Faces, but after the sympathizer had come out. And so, Nothing Ever Dies. Yeah. I love that book. And it was just so interesting. It was so interesting to read because I also came to that project when I was thinking myself about writing for non-academic audiences. Like he arrived in my life at exactly the right time because I was like, wow, this is how you do it. And he's also, I mean, Viet is like inspiring in so many ways, but one of them to me is that he is someone who's unafraid to wear his political commitments on his sleeve. And I have a very soft spot for him personally because he didn't what briefly I worked at the 92nd Street Y and like that whole debacle, like he did an event with us and we moved it successfully and he was just so steadfast that through that process. It happened so fast, it was crazy, and he was just a great person to be working with. But he really like gives a great example of like how you can have your intellectual and political commitments in your intellectual work, like in his life as an academic, and also carry that through to both your personal life, like his social media presence and the way that he talks to people, and to the work he does that's outward facing and, what we in academia call like public writing, as though
Oh,
anyone
wait, you have a term for it? Wait, I didn't know that academics had a term for it. I guess you
yeah,
have a term for everything, but
well, we hilariously call it public writing, which implies that academic writing is private writing. Which is very funny because, when you think about private writing, you think of like journals and stuff, like
yeah,
journals,
letters.
academic journals. Yeah. I don't know. Maybe I've been out of the game for a year or two, so maybe it's changed. Maybe it is more people doing it. Like maybe it's not called that anymore, but that was in fact what it was called. And he's really a hero. I think he's like an inspiration to a lot of people to write like his memoir, The Man of Two Faces, is so brilliant because it's both like personal, it's his family story, it's this historical account, it's everything. It's just wrapped up so beautifully together. I think it's a great example of how you don't just have to have one project. And this goes back to what you're saying about how you read Bibliophobia as two books. I think that's perfect because that's exactly, I mean, that is often how I've described it to people myself. So I'm really glad to hear you say it. It's both like a book, if you want it to be a book for scholars or for scholarly readers, it can be. It can be a critical book, but it's also a personal book and a memoir. It can just be, a story about depression, a story about families, a story about finding yourself or losing yourself. And I think that Viet was the great model for just having multiple projects at once.
And also part of why I bring it up is you and I can branch in two different directions based on Viet. So we're going to do choose your own adventure for a second.
Okay.
Because we can either go straight to Jeff Dyer and out of sheer rage.
We do have the same taste.
We do. We totally have the same. Or we can go to A.S. Byatt and Possession. So I'm going to let you choose. Because obviously we'll circle back, but you pick.
Well, I know you want to talk about Possession. And I always want to talk about, there's never a time in my life when I don't want to talk about Possession.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like because Byatt recently died, to honor her memory, we should talk about Possession.
Okay.
But I really love Jeff Dyer. Like I've been thinking about, as I've been finishing Bibliophobia and thinking about like what I'd like to do next, I was telling my partner that I just want to be like an Asian lady Jeff Dyer. I just want to like,
I would like to read that book. Whatever that book is, I would very much like to read that book.
I would like to like travel around and like do weird things and write weird books. Like that sounds great.
Please do that. I would like to read those.
Well, I hope Brandon has listening because I would like to do that.
But Possession was put in front of me when I was a baby bookseller, so this is a really long time ago. And, it's got that jacket. It's very sort of Rococo kind of jacket. And the people around me who were reading it kept saying, well, it's a romance. It's a romance. And I may have mentioned that, Boston thing. And, romance is not the thing you think of when you think of a Bostonian, right? And I tried reading it because, you try to read everything, and it didn't click for me. But you have this amazing way of describing possession that actually made me download a copy of the e-book.
That's great.
because you're talking about it much more as a quest than, it's just, and obviously everyone has different ways of coming to this particular book, but I think you changed my mind with just that one sort of swivel where it's like, oh, it's a quest narrative. Oh.
It is a really interesting sort of generic experiment. And I think that, so the full title of the book is Possession, a Romance.
Right.
And I think that Biot is very knowing when she uses that word. She knows that people will read it wrong. And
hi, that would be me.
You're just parroting what you were told. Like the people who were telling you that it was like a romance novel, like there are romance plots in it. Like there are pairs of lovers who have missed encounters and come together and fall apart and all that stuff. But that's not the point of the book. The point, I think, is I think that Biot very clearly means it to be a romance like a quest narrative, like the Chanson de Roland or something, where it's like there's something chivalric about it, about the search for the experience of reading. That's what the book is really about to me. Like I think it's such a great, if you look at it as a book about reading, or I think there are like many ways you can look at it. You can look at it as a romance, and you can look at it as a book about loving reading and sort of losing that love and finding it again. You can look at it as a comedy about academics, which is also true, or you can look at it, it's usually described as a literary detective novel. And I think I don't know, that a description used to bother me because I felt like it was so much more than that, and it sounds so ridiculous. But it actually is, like, when it's one of many ways of describing the book, like a good way of describing it. Like there is a sort of propulsive quest for a man, like literary evidence for this relationship in it. Like it is a kind of, it highlights the ways that all readers are detectives and they're always looking for something when they're reading.
And that's where you sold me. And that's where I was just kind of like, oh, I have to rethink everything I believe about this book. Because also, you do have this lovely line where you're like, and A.S. Biot's flamboyant virtuosity. And I was like, oh, that sounds like fun.
Yeah, I think that the mistake that people make with Possession, and I have a real bone to pick actually with the 2003 movie adaptation.
Oh, I have not seen that.
Don't.
Okay.
Horrible. It's like really a shame because first of all, an American filmmaker made it, which I think is very wrong. So it's very English. It was directed and I think written by Neil LaBute, who makes very different kinds of movies.
Oh, yeah, that doesn't feel like a No, that doesn't feel like a Neil LaBute project.
It's like a Neil LaBute movie starring Aaron Eckhart, which is very confusing. Like
as an academic?
As an academic. Yeah, it's a whole other thing. But I think that people often misunderstand it by thinking that it has to be serious. I think because that cover, that like William Morris cover, like it looks like it's large, looks like a capital B book, and it won the Booker. Like it seems like a serious
in
book.
hardcover. It was a beast too. Like you really had to sort of
it's not actually that long. The paperback is like a normal size book, but how it inflated.
Hardcover. I just remember, when you were you had to sort of do the tuck under the arm thing because it wasn't really. Yeah.
I mean, she has written many very long books, but Possession is really in the middle of them. But I think that the people misread it as like a serious highbrow literary romance, and it's actually very funny. It's very funny. And it'll make you laugh, like, as someone who just, like, knows this world and, like, knows about how books are used and used. Yeah, it's funny. It's delightful. I think that, like, one has to allow oneself to be delighted by a possession, and it's better to go into it without expectations rather than having someone say, "You have to read this. It won the Booker in 1990. It's a very serious book."
I just also, I do believe that you meet a book when there's so many things where I'm human. I pick things up, I put them down. Sometimes I finish them, sometimes I don't. Obviously, it's different when you're prepping for an interview. there are times where things get finished no matter what. But I love the idea that just because something was maybe not published last week, it can still be new to someone, right? Like Invisible Man, by the way, still holds up. I don't know the last time you read the Ralph Ellison novel, but like that really holds up. And I love the idea that book came out in 1957 and it's like,
It's still fresh.
oh, this is terrific. Like, and sometimes, or like you read James Baldwin and like the language just swings, right? And you're like, wait a minute, he wrote this in 1963? Like, what? And I love that. I read like you do. It's like, what's new? What's going to open my world? Occasionally, I get turned away from things that maybe I should have picked up sooner. But that's the fun of it, right? Like, that's where I'm just like, you talk a lot about immersion, right? And how immersion, like, you want to be the air that sort of flips around in a book, that you want to be that deeply immersed in it, regardless of what genre or whatever. And I love those images.
Thank you. Yeah, I love reading old books. I think
Mm-hmm.
that Baldwin, like it's crazy that someone who was born 100 years ago this year
Mm-hmm.
writes in prose that feels as fresh today as it did when
Right?
it was published. Like it's really astounding. Like it
Mm-hmm.
just and I think that one thing when you're a young reader that's like really one of the most eye-opening, amazing experiences is reading something. I mean, speaking of like serious books, like someone who's like one of our great intellectuals, like James Baldwin, you like read a book and you think it's going to be hard and serious, but then it's actually you just can't stop reading it, and it's really like it sweeps you up and it's really propulsive and it's really like new feeling. I think that's one of the most amazing experiences.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah, I was thinking of I remember speaking of possession, like another book that
Mm-hmm.
won Booker like around that time was Midnight's Children. And
Love.
I remember
Love.
thinking it looked so serious, like it looked and everyone talked about it in like hushed reverential
Yeah, yeah,
tones.
yeah.
Like
Oh, I
someone
remember.
who's this great intellectual and he's written this like very serious book. But then I finally it put me off for a long time, but I finally read it probably in college and I was
Yeah.
like, no one told me this is a funny book. It's like it's
Yep.
kind of crazy and fantastical
Yep.
and funny and magical and it's also, like, serious in lots of ways, but, these books, th we don't always get told the secret truth of them. Like, we're often, like they're foisted on us, we have to read them for school, like, I actually haven't read Invisible Man for many years, even though speaking of Viet, I was thinking of it because
Yep.
he writes about Allison so much, but I read it in school and probably haven't gone back to it since then. We get so much so early, like before we're ready to take these things in. Like they're piled on us. And even if you're a good reader, like if you have that many books that you have to be reading and you read for tests and you read for whatever, like it's hard to let yourself be moved by things.
It took me a long time to come to Steinbeck for
Mm,
exactly that reason. And then I read East of Eden, and one, he's funny. And I
mhm.
was like, wait, no one told me Steinbeck was funny. East of Eden is an amazing American novel, but Midnight's Children, same thing. I read it when I was in my early 20s, and then I reread it when Knife was coming out, and I reread it, and oh, wow, it is. I'm certainly not the same person I was when I read it the first time,
Yeah.
but it was so much fun, and it's so gorgeous, and it still has all of this weight, right? Like, it's kind of nice to sink back in. Sometimes a reread is a good thing.
Oh, I love to read. Yeah, I do it all the time.
I have also discovered books that I loved when I was younger where I'm like, oh yeah, oh, there's some stuff from the Beats where I'm like, yep, don't need to read that
Oh,
again. There is some stuff, and again, there's a book for everyone, don't get me wrong, but like there's some stuff that I loved when I was 18, 19, 20 where I'm like, yep, I'm good, thanks. Okay, 18-year-old me, that's great.
yeah. I read a lot of like 60s through 80s fantasy that's like that,
Oh,
like real like fantasy boy type books. And I inherited my brother's collection of books when he went to college. So I read
right.
like all this stuff, like, and a lot of it is so misogynistic. I had no idea. I just was like, it was when I was like in this period when I was probably 10, just reading a
Right.
lot of like whatever was there, and I loved fantasy, and
Hmm.
so I just read and read and read like until there's no more, and it just didn't like bother me, or it just went in one eye and out the other. And I remember reading um I'm gonna throw Roger Zelazny under the bus because I remember reading him. I loved those books when I was young, and I thought they were like so amazing and like interesting and weird and whatever. And then I read them again. I still remember the moment of encounter. I was uh in college at the bookstore, and I was like, oh, there's a collection of Roger Zelazny. I've not read him for 10 years or whatever it was at that point. And then I started, and after the first couple of pages, I was like, I can't continue. I can't go on. Like this is so horrible. But they were really important to me. Like when not important in the same way as Montgomery or certainly Morrison or like anyone like that, but they were just the era that I read. Like they were that kind of book. I just read, I inhaled them. Like I read so many of them, and I can't remember most of them now. Probably a good thing,
Hey,
but
listen, I've read V.C. Andrews' Flowers in the Attic, Uh,
mm,
sometimes you just read the thing that's, you
it's
know,
there. Yeah, same.
but it is I mean, that was the worst thing. I was just like, oh, running out of things to read, and my brother and I would pass stuff back and forth when we were traveling and things like that. But I mean, when you think about it now, like you've got N.K. Jemisin, right? You've got Nettie or Corafor. You've got R.F. Kuang. Like there's a lot, and I'm leaving people out, but there's a lot of like really exciting. Oh, Samantha Shannon, that Priory of the Orange Tree, like there is some really, really, really interesting good stuff happening. And I like watching the evolution, right? I like watching the evolution of story, which I'm one of those people who will say, yeah, telling stories is the first human thing we ever did. And but it's kind of great to just start building the muscle for reading, right? Like do I still like Marmalade because of Paddington? Who knows? I wouldn't be surprised.
Yeah,
No 8-year-old likes marmalade. Okay, no 8-year-old likes the taste of marmalade. Like
especially
let's
the
let's not
trek.
pretend.
Yeah. No, it is really great. And it's also like wonderful. It's wonderful to re-encounter books and be like, this is better than I remember reading. Like, or it's just as good. And it's really wonderful to think of like this generation of young readers being able to encounter the books they loved when they were younger and still love them and not have that moment like I had with Zelazny, right? Like I've done some rereading of some books that, well, for this book, I reread a lot of books, but I've done some rereading of other books that were important to me, like sort of in that mode and that kind of magical reading. Like I reread Susan Cooper's Darkest Rising every year, and it's just as good every time. It's like still I just this year I actually didn't read it physically. I listened to this BBC radio production of it that Rob McFarlane
Oh,
did.
cool.
It's amazing. It's really brilliant. And it's just so wonderful to like re-encounter those books that were magical to you and find they're
Hmm.
still magical. Philip Pullman is that way to me.
Yeah.
Like Meredith M. Pierce is someone else who's like that to me. Like, I read those books again and I'm like, wow, I feel like I've changed. I know I've changed so much, but this is still magical to me. And to think that like more readers, the further we go, the more books come out that will stand the test of time. The more readers will have that experience more frequently. I think that's wonderful.
one of the things I came to while I was prepping for this show is it's called the Fante Papers, and it is something that you did with three friends who are also very smart academic women, including Merve Emre, who I think is pretty cool. So it's like, what is going on here? And I think you have changed my mind about Fante. I will totally own the fact that I have picked up and put down, picked up and put down. You know how it goes, right? Like sometimes you find the thing and you're like, I should. And I've even had people say to me, like, you of all people would love these books. You know.
I mean, sometimes that makes me not want to like resentfully kind of feel like, why should I read this? I feel like for me, that's Rachel Cusk, who I know I will love. I read Outline, I think the first book, but I haven't read the rest of the trilogy. And I liked it a lot, but everyone is like so intent on me reading Cusk that I'm like, I'm not gonna do it.
I get it. I totally get it. But back to Ferrante. And I really like the way this book opens. It's Columbia University Press. You are literally in conversation with four of your good friends. You're all academics. You're all very, very, very smart and very good writers. And it's really kind of fun to watch you guys play over the Ferrantes. And okay, another one that I pick up, put down, pick up, put down, pick up, put down, pick up, put down. And I think the opening of your eavesdropping on you and your friends talking about the Ferrantes, I'm like, maybe I need to rethink my relationship. Because I really like Days of Abandonment. I mean, there are Ferrantes that I like. That book is wild. And I really...
It's one of the greatest books I've ever read.
Right? Okay.
So it's such a life ruiner. Like I read that book and I read it when I was living in this apartment in New York where the door like didn't always open.
Sorry.
which is like a feature of the book where the character in the like can't get out of her apartment. And I remember after I read that book, I couldn't get out of my apartment. And I was like, oh my God, it's happening.
Sorry. That's great. No, Days of Abandonment, I love the purity of the sentences and that just it's dripping in emotion in ways that you don't always get in these tiny little type books, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it is, I love that book. It is just, it's wild, that book. But I have run colder, much colder on the Neapolitan. And I understand why I really understand why people love them. But every time I start, I get about 10 or 15 pages in and I'm like, this is not for me. But I really, really love kind of how the four of you approach these books in a way that feels much more intimate, right? Like you are, and I'm not used to academics being sort of open about their stuff, right? I'm still laughing that you guys call it public writing. Like, what? I'm sorry, what?
Yeah. I feel like that was a trade secret I was not supposed to give away.
All right, well, sorry, academia. Can we talk about for listeners who might not pick up the Columbia University Press title, can we talk about your relationship to Ferrante and sort of how you came in? Because I do also think this comes back to bibliophobia in a way that is really interesting. I'm just going to own the Ferrantes. I will come back to them.
Well, I hope you do, because I mean, they're amazing books to reread. I've read all four of the tetralogy probably 5 or 6 times.
Okay.
Now I'm partly for like fact checking that book and whatever the equivalent of fact checking an academic book is. They are books that like every time I read them, I'm like, I feel, speaking of feeling differently about books, like I feel like I have a different favorite one every time I read them.
Okay.
And part of it is getting older. Like when I started reading Ferrante, I was 30, and now I'm 40. Like it's just like a whole I went from identifying certain kinds of narratives that appear in the early books as being like the ones that I identified most closely with, or sort of imagine myself like in this, like trying to find yourself as a woman and an intellectual and trying to distinguish yourself from your best friend, which, as you know, is something that I have trouble with and have always sort of had complicated relations to. But now that I'm older, like I really feel the third book a lot and the fourth book. But the
Okay.
third one especially, like it's incredible. It's one of those things where you put down the second book ends on a cliffhanger and you put it down, you're like, how can this like what well, they all sort of end on these moments of suspense. And I think it's really interesting to see her take a story that you don't think will be a suspense story, like this story of two girls growing up in Naples, poor and like wanting to be writers. You think it'll be a very different it's many different kinds of books, but you don't think that one of those kinds will be this kind of, like, edge of your seat, like, cliffhanger type. But there it is a book that's full of, like, the suspense of real life, and, I refer to it, I guess, as one book, 'cause in Italian, it's just called My Brilliant Friend. It's just one book, like,
Hmm.
true style, like, one book in many parts, and I think that, part of what I really treasure about Ferrante is being able to read her in different parts of my life. Like, I feel like every year I'm a little different and I read the books a little differently. And I love that women of like all ages can read these books. And, Marguerite talks about like reading them. She got them from her mom. And many people have talked about that experience, like reading. I, in fact, gave them to my mom, and we have talked about them since. Like, you can read them as mother and daughter. Like, I've also like talked to students about. I taught My Brilliant Friend in the last class that I taught, and my students were obsessed with it. I had this class of mostly women. They were amazing 20 20 out of 21 students were women, and that the one boy was, like, very, very sweet and patient, and clearly was intimidated by these, like, brilliant female students around him, but they just it really captured them, like, it really spoke to them, and they were amazing talking about it because it really, like I think it really has the power to grab out and sort of reach you and pull you along with it. I think that's, from the first time reading Ferrante to this time, like that never goes away. Like it always I'm always surprised by them. And I think that's an amazing talent to have. Like it's very rare. Like sometimes you reread books because you know exactly what's going to happen. But sometimes you reread books and you're like, this isn't what I thought had happened, or these characters were not how I thought they were. And a large part of the Ferrante project was to give us a space to do the kind of writing that's not usually valorized in our profession. And we were all pre tenure when we started, we were junior scholars. We were supposed to be doing other things. You know, like each of us had departments kind of breathing down our neck, being like, you should be writing your academic monograph. Why are you doing this? I had older scholars be like, this is nice, but like, you shouldn't be doing this in various conferences. Like, why are you writing this book? And it started kind of it started online. It was a blog at first before it was a book. And it was just sort of like an experiment, as the subtitle of the book says, is experiment in like how we could combine our worlds, like how we could be people, but we could also be scholars. And we could be friends, but we could also be colleagues. And we could have our own ideas, but we could also share ideas and like not be possessive about claims. And that's what we really wanted to tell. A lot of academics are already doing this work. Like everyone is doing this work. They're not always publishing it though, or they're not admitting that it's this kind of work because they won't get the credit for it. But, we just were hoping that more people would be taken by that idea of being like, I don't do anything alone. Like I don't do any of my work by myself. And that's like a good thing.
Oh, it's so true, though. I mean, every one of us brings what we know and who we are to what we read. None of us gets to read the same book the same way, and I think that's kind of cool when I think about it. Anyway, Sarah, it was so great to hang out with you. Thank you so much for joining us on Poured Over. Bibliophobia is out now. And I have my brilliant friend in possession in front of me, so I've got some reading to do. Thanks again.
Great. Thanks, Miwa.
Thank you for listening. Poured Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.